The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of alkali dust, and Ruth Carver pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as the grit settled on everything like a second skin. Dry Creek, Colorado Territory. 1878, it looked exactly like its name suggested. The town squatted beneath a merciless sun, its weathered boards the color of old bones, signs creaking in the endless wind that swept down from the mountains. Ruth clutched her carpetbag with one hand and the land deed with the other. Feeling the weight of widowhood in every step down from the coach, the driver spat tobacco juice into the dust and jerked his thumb toward a row of storefronts. "Land office is that-a-way, ma'am. Though I'd think twice about claiming any property out here if I were a woman alone." She didn't bother explaining that thinking twice was a luxury she couldn't afford. The deed to Tract 14 was all she had left after James died on the Santa Fe trail shot in what the authorities called a hunting accident, though no one had bothered to investigate why a farmer would be hunting so far from any game trails. The land office smelled of sweat and old leather. The clerk, a thin man with suspicious eyes, laughed outright when she presented her papers. "Tract 14, lady. That salt land with dead water. Your husband must have bought it sight unseen from some eastern swindler." "My husband is dead," Ruth said flatly, "and I'll take what's mine." The clerk's amusement faded to a calculating look that made her skin crawl. "Vernon Pike's been eyeing that tract. Might be willing to take it off your hands for enough to get you back east where you belong." "I belong where I choose to belong." Ruth's first glimpse of Asher Boone came at the water rights auction that afternoon. She'd forced herself to attend, needing to understand how things worked in this hard country. He stood apart from the crowd of ranchers and speculators, tall and weathered as a fence post, dust coating his long duster. Gray eyes watching everything with the wariness of a man who'd learned not to trust easily. When he bid on water rights for the Eastern Valley, other men stepped back. Someone muttered, "Water Baron," like it was both a title and a curse. She found herself studying him not with any romantic notion, for her heart was still buried with James, but with the practical assessment of someone learning to navigate dangerous territory. Here was power in Dry Creek, and power meant either protection or threat. The landscape beyond town was a testament to nature's cruelties: sagebrush and cactus, red earth cracked like old leather, skies stretched thin as heated metal. Ruth hired a wagon to take her to Tract 14, coughing as the dust invaded her throat, tasting salt and something bitter like gunpowder. The land was worse than she'd imagined, the creek bed carved through it like a scar, bone dry. The survey markers were broken, and someone had scattered the stones. A thin boy, maybe 12, skin burnt dark by the sun, appeared from behind a boulder. "You, the widow, bought this patch?" He studied her with old eyes in a young face. "Name's Billy. I work odd jobs hereabouts. This here creek only runs during spring melt, and barely then. Boone's outfit controls the water channel through the valley. Without access to that, you might as well try farming the moon." Ruth surveyed her domain, 40 acres of desolation, but it was hers. "Then I'll have to find another way." Billy snorted. "Ain't no other way, ma'am. That's why your land was so cheap." At the general store, Ruth tried to rent a hand pump. The owner, a German named Lang, quoted a price 3 times what she'd expected. "Freight costs," he said, though his eyes said something else. "Besides, a pump won't help if there's no water to pump. A widow alone won't last the season out here. This ain't country for delicate women." "I'm not delicate." "You will be sun-dried and wind-cured if the Lobos or the claim jumpers don't get you first." She was counting out her carefully hoarded coins when a shadow fell across the counter. Asher Boone stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with those careful eyes. "Add the freight to my account, Lang." His voice was low, unused to wasting words. Ruth's spine stiffened. "I pay my own way, Mr. Boone." "No charity intended. Ma'am, Lang's trying to charge you the stranger's price. Regular freight is $2, not $6. Lang flushed but adjusted his ledger. Ruth paid the fair price, neither thanking Boone nor meeting his eyes. She'd learned that gratitude could be a trap, creating debts that multiplied like compound interest. But as she loaded the pump parts into her hired wagon, she noticed Boone watching from the saloon porch, not with the predatory interest she'd seen in other men's faces, but with something that might have been recognition one survivor acknowledging another. That first night on her land, Ruth made camp with the meager supplies she'd brought. She built a fire from greasewood and juniper, the smoke stinging her eyes, the vastness of the sky pressed down. Stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. Coyotes called from the ridges, and she kept James's old Spencer rifle close, though her hands shook too badly to shoot straight. She'd thought she knew about being alone. She'd been wrong. Loneliness in town was one thing here, with nothing but wind and stone for company. It was like drowning in empty space. But she'd be damned if she'd crawl back to Ohio with her tail between her legs, to live on her sister's charity, and listen to whispers about the foolish widow who'd chased her dead husband's dreams west. Near dawn, she found boot prints around her camp, too fresh to be from yesterday's visitors. Someone had stood watching while she slept. A bullet was embedded in one of her survey stakes, a warning or a promise. Ruth gripped the Spencer until her knuckles went white. The sun rose like a threat over the eastern mountains, painting the desert the color of dried blood. She made coffee strong enough to strip paint, ate hardtack that tasted like disappointment, and began the work of survival. She would not run. She would not beg. If this land wanted to kill her, it would have to work for it. And if the men of Dry Creek thought one widow would be easy prey, they'd learn otherwise. She'd bury them all if she had to, right next to whatever dreams she'd once had about the West being a place for new beginnings. But first, she had to find water. Everything else justice for James, a future worth having. Even the luxury of proper grief would have to wait. In this country, water was life, and life was the only currency that mattered. Ruth Carter had come to Dry Creek with nothing but paper promises and stubborn pride. Time would tell if that would be enough. The wind picked up, driving sand against her face like tiny needles, and she squinted toward the distant mountains where snow still clung to the peaks. Somewhere between here and there, water flowed. She just had to survive long enough to find it. The afternoon sun hammered down like a blacksmith's anvil when Ruth rode into Dry Creek for supplies. She'd learned to wrap her face against the dust, to move slowly in the heat, to ration her water like a miser counting coins. 3 weeks on Tract 14 had already carved new lines around her eyes and roughened her hands beyond any farmer's wife's. She was tying her borrowed mule to the hitching post when Pike's men surrounded her. 3 of them, smelling of whiskey and sweat, with the lazy confidence of predators who'd cornered easy prey. Well now, if it ain't the widow woman playing at homesteading. The largest one, a man with tobacco-stained teeth, deliberately knocked her flour sack to the ground. White powder exploded across the boardwalk like snow. Shame about your supplies? Course, accidents happen when ladies venture where they don't belong. Ruth's hand moved toward the rifle on her saddle, but another man grabbed her wrist. Now, no need for unpleasantness. Mister, Pike just wants you to know he's still interested in buying you out. Generous offer, too. More than salt land's worth. Tell Mr. Pike, Ruth began, but the words died as Asher Boone materialized from the mercantile's shadow. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, just stood there, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, gray eyes taking in the scene. The atmosphere shifted like wind changing direction before a storm. This your business? Boone. The big man's bravado cracked slightly. It is now. Asher stepped down from the boardwalk, his spurs ringing against the wood. Lang, add a sack of flour to my account. The ladies was damaged. We weren't doing nothing but talking. One of Pike's men protested. Then you're done talking. Asher's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who rarely needed to repeat himself. Move along. They went, but their retreat carried promises of future trouble. Ruth found herself alone with Boone, acutely aware of his presence, of the way other townspeople suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. I know what you need and don't need, Mrs. Carver. He touched his hat brim. But Pike's testing boundaries. Better he learns early that you're not without allies. I'm not your ally either, Mr. Boone. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. No, ma'am. But we're heading the same direction just now. Might as well ride together for safety. The logic was sound, even if her pride rebelled. She nodded stiffly and let him help reload her supplies, noting how his hands were gentle with her packages despite their scarred roughness. The ride back to Tract 14 stretched long under the copper sky. They stopped at a high ridge to water the horses from Asher's canteen. He carried 3, she noticed, a wealthy man's precaution in dry country. Your husband, Asher said suddenly, gazing out over the valley. He was James Carver, bought land sight unseen from the Eastern Pacific Land Company. You knew him? Knew of him. He wrote me once, asking about water access. I told him to steer clear of Tract 14. He paused. I'm sorry he didn't listen. He was following a dream, Ruth said, surprised to find herself defending James to this stranger. He believed in something better. Dreams die hard out here. Asher's voice carried weight beyond the words. My brother had dreams too. Thought we could make the desert bloom like Eden. Drought of 71 took him. He was 16. The confession hung between them like morning mist. Ruth studied his profile, weathered but not old, maybe 35 to her 28. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into too many suns, carrying too many burdens. Is that why you control the water, to keep his dream alive? I control the water because water is power, and power keeps you alive in this country. His honesty was brutal as the landscape. But lately, I wonder if surviving is the same as living. They crested the ridge as the sun touched the western mountains, setting the world ablaze. The vista opened before them, miles of nothing becoming everything in that light. Ruth felt her breath catch despite herself. It's beautiful, she whispered, then felt foolish. Beautiful and deadly, Asher agreed. Like most things worth having. They sat their horses in silence, watching the day die in glory. The moment stretched, filled with something unnamed but understood. Then Asher shifted, breaking the spell. There's an old Apache seep on your northern boundary. Might still hold water if you dig deep enough. Practical information, valuable as gold. Ruth nodded her thanks. But as she turned to look at him, something in the air shifted. Maybe it was the way the dying light caught in his eyes, or the loneliness that echoed her own, or simply the human need for connection in a place that specialized in isolation. She touched his hand where it rested on his saddle horn. Just a touch, fingers brushing scarred knuckles, but he turned his hand palm up, catching hers for a heartbeat that stretched like taffy. Neither spoke. Words would have broken whatever fragile understanding was building between them. But when he leaned toward her, she met him halfway. The kiss was brief, tasting of dust and possibility, gentle as rain in the desert. A freight wagon rumbled along the valley road below, and they broke apart. Someone on that wagon stopped, looked up, a witness to carry tales back to town. I should go, Ruth said, face burning with more than sunset. I'll see you safe to your land. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different silence than before, charged with awareness and the knowledge of a line crossed. At her campsite, Asher helped her unload but didn't linger. That was a mistake, Ruth said quietly. Maybe, he swung back into his saddle. But mistakes are what make us human. She watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the darkening sky, then turned to her evening chores with hands that trembled for new reasons. By noon the next day, all of Dry Creek knew. The story had grown in the telling, as stories do. The widow and the water baron, embracing under the stars like lovers in a dime novel. By evening, the newspaper editor, a weasel-faced man named Hartley, had penned his headline, "The widow kissed the rich cowboy beneath the stars only to rise as his reluctant wife." Ruth learned of it when she returned to town 2 days later, the moment she entered the mercantile. Conversations died. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed. Men's gazes lingered with new speculation. At the saloon, someone was reading Hartley's article aloud to general amusement. Sources report the passionate embrace lasted several minutes, with the widow clearly pursuing the wealthy rancher's affections. Ruth's face burned, but she held her head high as she conducted her business. It wasn't until Sheriff Harlan cornered her outside the land office that she understood the full implications. "This is a respectable town, Mrs. Carver," Harlan said, his badge glinting like a threat. "We don't cotton to loose behavior. Now, if you were to make things proper like with Mr. Boone, that'd be different. But if you're planning to conduct yourself like a woman of questionable morals, we might have to reconsider whether Tract 14 is suitable for your ownership. You're threatening to take my land because of gossip. I'm suggesting you consider your position. A woman alone, no protection, no water rights." He spread his hands. "Lot of accidents can happen out here." Ruth left the sheriff's office with her mind racing. She'd survived poverty, widowhood, and the journey west. She wouldn't be driven out by provincial morality and malicious tongues. When Asher appeared at her camp that afternoon, hat in hand, she was almost expecting him. "I heard what happened in town," he said without preamble. "This is my fault." "Unless you wrote that article yourself, I don't see how." "I'm offering a solution." He met her eyes steadily. "A marriage contract, business arrangement. You keep your land and gain water rights. I provide protection from pike and respectability in town. 1 year. Then you can decide whether to make it permanent or dissolve it." Ruth laughed bitterly. "A marriage of convenience. How romantic." "Romance got us into this mess," he pointed out. "Maybe practical thinking can get us out." She wanted to refuse, to throw his offer back in his face. But she thought of the sheriff's threats, Pike's escalating harassment, the impossible task of surviving without water. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I want it in writing. I keep title to my land. No husbandly claims, and the right to end it after 1 year." "Agreed." They were married 3 days later by a circuit judge in a ceremony as dry as the desert wind. The few witnesses whispered behind their hands. Ruth wore her best dress still dusty from travel, and Asher wore a clean shirt that didn't quite hide the gun on his hip. "You may kiss the bride," the judge intoned. Their lips barely touched, nothing like that sunset moment on the ridge. Then they walked out into the harsh daylight, legally bound strangers who'd shared one honest moment and now had to live with the consequences. The ride back to Tract 14 was silent. At the boundary of her land, Asher stopped. "I'll send men to start digging that well tomorrow, and I'll set up a tent outside for myself. This is your home. I won't intrude more than necessary." Ruth nodded, throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. They'd solved one problem by creating a dozen others. But as she watched him set up his camp at a respectful distance, she wondered if maybe, in this hard country where survival trumped all else, a practical partnership might grow into something more. The stars came out, brilliant and unforgiving as witnesses. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Ruth touched her lips, remembering that first kiss, and wondered if she'd traded her freedom for safety, or if perhaps she'd found a different kind of freedom altogether. Only time would tell. In the desert, time was as patient and merciless as the sun itself. The first days of their reluctant union passed like travelers sharing a road parallel lives that never quite touched. Ruth woke each dawn to find Asher already working, his silhouette against the rising sun as he hauled water from his wagon to fill her barrels. She learned his rhythms coffee before first light, checking the horizon like a man reading scripture, the careful way he documented water usage in a leather journal. The hand pump arrived in pieces, and Ruth insisted on helping assemble it despite Asher's protests. Her hands blistered against the metal, split at the seams from the alkaline soil. When he found her trying to wrap them with torn petticoat strips, he disappeared into town and returned with proper leather work gloves and a tin of salve. "You're not used to accepting help," he observed, watching her struggle to pull the gloves over her bandaged palms. "I'm not used to needing it," she shot back, but there was less acid in her voice than before. Exhaustion had a way of wearing down pride like water on stone. The landscape seemed determined to test them. Each dawn brought new challenges, scorpions in the water buckets, dust devils that scattered their supplies, the endless battle against the sun that cracked lips and burned skin darker than saddle leather. Ruth learned to move in the cooler hours, to read the sky for signs of the brief, violent thunderstorms that brought more wind than water. Young Billy appeared regularly, drawn perhaps by the novelty of their arrangement or simply by Ruth's cooking, which, while plain, was reliable. The boy was all sharp angles and old wisdom, his past written in scars and silences. "You two are the talk of 3 counties, he announced one evening, accepting a plate of beans and cornbread. "Some folks betting you'll kill each other before the month's out. Others figure you're playing a long game for his water rights." "And what do you figure?" Ruth asked. Billy studied them with those 2 wise eyes. "I figure people who've been hungry know the value of a meal. People who've been thirsty know the value of water. And people who've been alone—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Asher grunted approval and showed the boy how to splice rope for the well pulley. Ruth watched them work, noting how gentle Asher was with his teaching, how his gruff corrections carried no sting. She wondered if he was remembering his lost brother. The Apache seep proved to be more memory than reality, just a depression in the rocks that might hold water after rain. But as they dug, Asher explained the signs, the color of the stone, the way certain plants grew, the patient reading of the land's secrets. "Water leaves its history," he said, handful of sand running through his fingers. "Even when it's gone, it marks its passage." "Like people," Ruth murmured, thinking of James, of the brother Asher had lost, of all the ghosts that haunted this unforgiving country. They hit moisture at 12 feet, not enough for irrigation, but sufficient for survival. When the first muddy water pumped up, Ruth laughed with relief, not caring that tears cut tracks through the dust on her face. Asher smiled, a rare, transformative expression that made him look years younger. That night, a dust storm howled in from the north. The tent Asher had pitched flew away like paper, and Ruth found him trying to shelter the horses, sand driving into his face like ground glass. "Get inside!" she shouted over the wind. Pride warred with practicality on his face. But when the lantern in her dugout shelter flickered like a beacon, he followed her in. They sat out the storm inches apart, the small space filled with the sound of wind trying to tear the world apart. Ruth gripped the center pole as it shuddered, and when a particularly violent gust nearly collapsed one wall, Asher's arm came around her, steady as iron. "Just the wind," he said quietly. "I've built it to hold." She realized he'd reinforced her shelter while she wasn't watching, doubled the supports, added weight to the base, care disguised as casual maintenance. When dawn came, revealing a world scoured clean and their meager possessions scattered like dice, Ruth found herself laughing, the helpless sound of someone who could either laugh or go mad. "We're still here," she said. "That's what matters." Asher studied her with something like respect. "You're tougher than you look. Ruth Carver." "Boone," she corrected automatically, then flushed. It was the first time she'd used his name. The corner of his mouth quirked. Ruth Boone. Then. They spent the day salvaging what they could, working in companionable silence. When Pike's men rode by in the afternoon, obviously checking the damage, They found Ruth and Asher calmly repairing fence posts, presenting a united front that needed no words. Tension simmered beneath the surface of their arrangement. Asher maintained strict boundaries, sleeping outside, knocking before approaching her shelter, never presuming intimacy despite their legal bond. But awareness crackled between them like static before a storm. Ruth caught herself watching the efficient grace of his movements, the way he gentled the horses, the rare moments when grief or memory shadowed his face. One evening, as they shared a meal of salt pork and biscuits, she asked about the water empire he'd built. "Started with one well," he said, staring into the fire. "My father's claim, he died before he could develop it. Left me and Sam, my brother, with debt and determination. I was 20. Sam was 12. I promised I'd take care of him. But the drought came. The drought came." His voice went flat. "I had water to sell, and people were desperate. I charged what the market would bear, supply and demand, simple economics, except nothing simple when children are thirsty. The Hendricks family, they had a sick baby, couldn't afford my prices. They tried to leave, got caught in a flash flood crossing Skeleton Wash." He paused. "All 5 of them, including the baby." Ruth set down her plate, appetite gone. "You blame yourself. I set the prices." He met her eyes. "I chose profit over people. Sam saw it clearer than me, said I was becoming something cold. Like this land. We fought about it the night before he died. He was trying to reach the Hendricks' old well. Thought there might be water others had missed. Heat stroke took him before noon." The confession lay between them like a wound. Ruth thought of her own losses, the weight of survival in a place that demanded such terrible choices. "You can't carry all the guilt," she said softly. "This land kills people. That's what it does." "Maybe, but I can choose what kind of man I am now." He looked at her across the fire. "That's why I helped you that first day in town, not charity penance." They sat in silence as the fire burned low, each lost in private griefs. But when Ruth shivered in the cooling air, Asher added wood to the fire without being asked, and when he dozed off over his ledger, she covered him with a blanket. Small kindnesses building like sediment into something stronger. The attack came 3 nights later. Ruth woke to the horses screaming and the smell of coal oil. Pike's men had cut the fence and were splashing fuel on the pump house. "Fire!" She grabbed James's rifle, hands steady now with purpose rather than fear. Asher was already moving, throwing sand on the flames before they could catch properly. A shot rang out, and he spun, clutching his shoulder. Ruth fired back, not aiming to kill but to drive them off, the Spencer kicking against her shoulder like a living thing. "And get to cover," Asher shouted. But Ruth held her ground, levering another round. "This is my land," she snarled, surprising herself with the ferocity in her voice. "My fight." Together they made a stand in the flickering light. Ruth's covering fire keeping the attackers at bay while Asher smothered the flames. When Pike's men finally retreated, whooping and shooting at the stars, they left behind cut fence, a damaged pump, and a new understanding between the unlikely partners. Ruth knelt beside Asher, checking his shoulder. The bullet had grazed him, leaving a furrow that bled freely but wouldn't kill. "You need stitching." "You know how. I've mended worse than this." She helped him to her shelter, aware of the solid weight of him, the way he tried not to lean on her despite the pain. By lamplight, she cleaned and stitched the wound, her hands steady now with purpose. He never flinched, though sweat beaded his forehead. When she finished, their eyes met and held. "Thank you," he said simply. "We're partners," she replied, the word carrying more weight than before. That night, for the first time, she didn't send him back outside. He slept sitting up in the corner, rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Ruth lay on her narrow cot, listening to his breathing, and realized that somewhere between the formal contract and this moment, something had shifted. They were no longer strangers playing at marriage, but allies forged in fire and darkness. The desert had tested them and found them sufficient together. The wolf pack came during the new moon, when darkness lay thick as wool over the desert. Ruth woke to the goats bleating in terror, their bells clanging discordantly against the pen walls. Through the window's slit, yellow eyes gleamed like fallen stars. "Stay inside," Asher commanded, already reaching for his Winchester. Like hell. Ruth grabbed the Spencer, checking the load. Her hands trembled not with fear now, but with the electric tension of defending what was hers. They burst from the shelter together. The pack had surrounded the pen, lean shapes flowing like smoke around the frightened animals. Ruth fired into the air, the muzzle flash illuminating bared teeth and raised hackles. The wolves scattered but didn't flee, circling just beyond the light's reach. The lead wolf, massive and grizzled, feinted toward the pen. Asher's lasso snaked out, catching a young goat just as the wolf lunged. Man and beast played tug-of-war with the terrified animal between them until Ruth put a shot close enough to singe the wolf's fur. It released its grip with a snarl. They stood back to back in the yard, turning slowly as the pack tested their resolve. When dawn finally grayed the eastern sky, the wolves melted away like bad dreams. Ruth and Asher stood panting in the dust, the rescued goat trembling between them. "You're laughing," Asher said wonderingly. She was helpless, slightly hysterical laughter. "We just fought wolves with our bare hands and borrowed courage. And won." He was grinning too, blood from his reopened shoulder wound staining his shirt. They were alive, victorious, ridiculous in their small triumph against the wild. The moment of levity died at noon when Vernon Pike arrived with 2 hired guns. He sat his horse like a king surveying peasants, his clothes too fine for the country, his smile sharp as alkali. "Mrs. Boone," he tipped his hat mockingly. "I've come with a final offer for Tract 14, given recent difficulties. I'm prepared to be generous. $500, cash money." "Not for sale," Ruth said flatly. Pike's smile thinned. "Everything's for sale. Ma'am, just a matter of price. Your husband there knows that better than most." He turned to Asher. "How much did you charge the Hendricks family for water?" "Boone. Before they died trying to find their own." Asher went rigid beside her. Ruth stepped forward. "Get off my land." "Your land for now." Pike studied them with reptilian calculation. "Accidents happen out here. Wells go bad, pumps break. Sometimes people disappear entirely, like your first husband. Tragic, really." The casual mention of James hit Ruth like a physical blow. "What do you know about my husband's death?" "I know he was advised to take a shortcut through my property. Dangerous country, full of claim jumpers and worse. Man traveling alone?" Pike shrugged. "But I'm sure you've drawn your own conclusions." Rage rose in Ruth's throat, hot and choking. Her finger found the trigger, the rifle barrel lifting toward Pike's chest. "Get out!" Pike's men reached for their guns, but Asher's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You heard my wife. This land has water now, and owners who'll defend it. Move along." For a moment, violence hung in the air like dust before rain. Then Pike laughed, cold and amused. "Your wife? How touching. The widow and the water baron, playing house on worthless land." He wheeled his horse. "This isn't over." They watched the riders disappear into the heat shimmer. Ruth's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the rifle. Asher took it gently, his fingers brushing hers. "He all but confessed to murdering James," she whispered. "Yes, I wanted to kill him. I almost... But you didn't. That's what separates us from men like Pike." He paused. "Though God knows I wanted to pull that trigger too." That night, Ruth couldn't stop pacing. Everything they'd built felt fragile as spun glass. The pump, already damaged, wheezed like a dying thing. The fence gaps yawned like missing teeth. And somewhere out there, Pike was planning his next move. "Teach me to shoot properly," she said suddenly. "Not just pointing and praying, real marksmanship." Asher looked up from the ledger he'd been pretending to study. "You did fine against the wolves." "Fine isn't good enough. Not anymore." She met his eyes. "I'm tired of being afraid. I want to be dangerous." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. All right. They started the next morning. Asher was a patient teacher, correcting her stance, her breathing, the way she squeezed versus pulled the trigger. "It's like a heartbeat," he explained, his hands adjusting her grip. "You fire between beats, in the stillness." Ruth tried not to notice the warmth of him behind her, the steady presence that made her feel both safe and unsettled. She focused on the target, a piece of tin they'd set on a fence post, and let everything else fade. The tin rang like a bell, her first clean hit. "Again," Asher said quietly. She fired until her shoulder ached and her ears rang, until hitting the target became meditation, until the rifle felt like an extension of her will. When Pike's threats echoed in her mind, she channeled them into cold precision. Market Day and Dry Creek tested their partnership differently. Ruth brought a basket of prickly pear preserves, made from fruit she'd gathered despite the thorns. The church women circled like vultures, their whispers following her from stall to stall. "Playing at being respectable now," one muttered. "As if we don't all know how this marriage started." Ruth kept her chin high, arranging her jars with deliberate care. When no one would buy, she fought the urge to flee. Then Mrs. Eliza Patterson, the minister's wife, approached. She was a small woman with kind eyes that had seen too much. "I'll take 2 jars, she said clearly, counting out coins. "My husband has a weakness for preserves." The small kindness nearly undid Ruth's composure. "Thank you," she managed. Mrs. Patterson studied Ruth's hands, scarred now, calloused, the hands of a woman who'd chosen survival over softness. "We all make our accommodations out here," she said quietly. "Some of us are just more honest about it." At Lang's store, Ruth traded preserves for supplies. Asher appeared as she struggled with a heavy sack of flour, wordlessly taking it from her. She noticed he'd added a Japanese handsaw to her purchases, a fine tool she couldn't afford, but desperately needed. "Partners," he said simply when she protested. That evening, they worked together to patch the damaged pump house. Ruth held boards while Asher hammered, their movements finding an easy rhythm. When she looked up at the star-scattered sky, she said quietly, "That kiss under the stars, I thought it was a mistake. Now I think it might have been the only honest thing between us." Asher's hammer paused. "And now?" "Now we're building something. I don't know what to call it, but it's real." She met his eyes. "Isn't it?" He set down the hammer, crossing to where she stood. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "The most real thing I've known in years." They didn't kiss. The moment was too fragile, too important for that. But when he drew her against him, she rested her forehead on his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the worn cotton of his shirt. They stood that way until the coffee pot boiled over, breaking the spell. Bad news came with dawn. One of Asher's ranch hands, old Miguel, who'd worked for his father, had been found dead by the water checkpoint. His neck was broken, a fall, the sheriff claimed, though everyone knew Miguel could ride before he could walk. Asher stood over the wrapped body, jaw clenched so tight Ruth feared he'd crack teeth. "This is my fault. I should have been harder on Pike from the start." "Stop!" Ruth gripped his arm. "Pike killed Miguel, not you. Channel that guilt into something useful or it'll eat you alive." He looked at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "When did you get so wise?" "When I stopped having the luxury of being foolish." She squeezed his arm. "We need to be smarter than Pike, not just angrier." That night, Ruth found something that changed everything. Hidden in the lining of James's old jacket was a map, yellow with age. Arrows marked a route through Pike's land to something labeled Orphan Spring. Notes in James's careful hand traced water rights that predated Pike's claims. Her hands went cold. James hadn't stumbled into an ambush he'd been lured. The friendly advice to take Pike's shortcut had been calculated murder. "My God," she breathed, staring at the evidence of premeditation. Asher studied the map, understanding dawning. This is proof, not just of murder, but of water theft. Pike's empire is built on stolen claims. Ruth felt something harden inside her chest, cold and implacable as desert stone. "Then we tear it down. Legally if we can, but one way or another. Pike pays for what he's done." "That's a dangerous path. Ruth." She looked at him steadily. "I'm tired of being prey. It's time to become the hunter." Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Ruth listened to their wild voices and felt an answering wildness rise in her own heart. The desert had carved away everything soft, leaving something harder but perhaps truer. She'd come west as a widow, seeking survival. Now she was becoming something else, a woman who could meet violence with violence, who could love without surrendering, who could build a life on bones and determination. The transformation wasn't complete. Might never be. But as she sat with Asher planning their next moves, she knew there was no going back. The reluctant bride was gone, replaced by something the desert had shaped from necessity and will. The journey to the county courthouse meant 3 days through hostile territory. Ruth packed the evidence carefully: the map, James's journal, the water rights documents wrapping them in oilcloth like sacred texts. Asher built a false bottom in a supply crate, carving Carver into the lid with deliberate strokes. "Your name," Ruth said, watching him work. "Your name first," he corrected. "The one that started this." They left before dawn, taking the longer route through Miller's Pass to avoid Pike's main holding. The trail wound through country that couldn't decide if it wanted to be desert or mountain, switching between scorching valleys and pine-shadowed ridges. On the second day, they came upon a Conestoga wagon tilted at a desperate angle, its occupants clustered in the shade of a wind-tortured juniper. A woman lay groaning on a makeshift pallet, her husband kneeling beside her with the helpless look of a man watching his world end. "Please," he called out. "My wife, the baby's coming too early." Ruth was off her horse before Asher could protest. The woman, hardly more than a girl, was deep in labor, her face flushed with fever and fear. "Boil water," Ruth ordered, falling back on knowledge hard-won from helping neighbor women in Ohio. "Clean cloths and pray." For the next 2 hours, the desert witnessed life fighting its way into the world. Ruth murmured encouragement, guided trembling hands, used precious water from their supplies without hesitation. Asher stood guard, but also offered his shoulder for the husband to grip during his wife's worst pains. When the baby finally arrived, tiny, fierce, perfect, her first cry split the air like hope itself. The mother wept with relief, the father with joy. And even Asher's eyes weren't entirely dry. "Faith," the mother whispered. "We'll call her Faith, born between nowhere and somewhere, but alive." They stayed until mother and child were stable, sharing food and water, helping right the wagon. As they prepared to leave, the father, introduced as Thomas Brewster, gripped Asher's hand. "I heard of you in town. They say you're hard about water, hard about money, but a hard man wouldn't stop for strangers." He glanced at Ruth with knowing eyes. "Maybe they're wrong about other things too." Word of the desert birth spread faster than wildfire. By the time Ruth and Asher reached Dry Creek for supplies, the story had transformed them from scandal to something approaching folk heroes. Ruth sold every jar of preserves within an hour, and old Mr. Gunther actually tipped his hat to Asher. Sunday service provided another test. They sat in the back pew, aware of eyes and whispers, but no longer flinching from them. Reverend Patterson preached about promises, how they bound not just man to woman, but community to community. soul to soul. Marriage, he said, looking directly at them, is a covenant, not chains to bind, but a foundation to build upon. Ruth felt Asher's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with something that felt like possibility. For the first time since their hasty courthouse wedding, she didn't pull away from the public display. After service, they encountered Marcus Holbrook, younger brother to one of Pike's gunmen. He studied Asher with curious eyes, no hostility in his weathered face. "My brother says you're the devil himself," Marcus said bluntly. "But I watched you during that birth. Devil wouldn't have gentled that man's fear the way you did." He paused. "Maybe you ain't the monster they paint you as." "Maybe none of us are exactly what they paint us as," Ruth replied. The seeds of change, once planted, grew in unexpected ways. At Lang's store, the proprietor mentioned offhandedly that Pike kept a private safe at Barlow's bank. "Seen Sheriff Harlan visiting after hours," he added, voice carefully neutral. "Through the back door, if you understand my meaning." Ruth and Asher exchanged glances. The web of corruption was revealing itself thread by thread. That evening, they sat outside watching stars emerge like scattered salt, the desert night wrapped around them, intimate and vast. Ruth found herself speaking fears she'd never voiced. "I'm terrified of caring again," she admitted. "James is barely cold, and here I am, feeling things I swore I'd never feel. It seems like betrayal." "You're alive," Asher said simply. "The dead don't begrudge the living their chances at happiness. Trust me, I've spent years learning that lesson." "Are you happy?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then I'm learning what it might feel like. You..." "Same." She turned to face him in the darkness. "I didn't expect you, Asher Boone, didn't expect any of this." "Life rarely asks our permission before changing everything." They danced then, slow and careful in the dusty yard. No music except crickets and wind. No steps except the ones they made up. His hand on her waist was steady, hers on his shoulder trusting. They moved together like people learning a new language, halting but sincere. "I'm falling in love with you," Ruth whispered, the words torn from her like a confession. "And it terrifies me." "Good," he murmured against her hair. "Terror keeps us honest out here." But he pulled her closer, and she felt his heart racing to match hers. Whatever grew between them was fragile as spring grass, but it was growing nonetheless. The next morning brought revelation. While sorting James's effects one final time, Ruth discovered something sewn into his vest, a button bearing the distinctive bull's head symbol of the grass ring, Pike's network of corrupt landowners and officials. He was one of them, she breathed, staring at the damning evidence. James was part of Pike's organization. Asher examined the button, understanding dawning. Maybe he tried to leave. Maybe that's why Pike had him killed. Ruth's voice was steady, despite the earthquake in her chest. He knew too much, wanted out, and Pike couldn't risk it. The betrayal cut deep, not just Pike's, but James's. Her husband had been part of the very corruption that now threatened her, but understanding brought its own cold comfort. James had died trying to do right, even if he'd started wrong. "This changes our approach." Asher said, if James was inside their organization, there might be more evidence, records, correspondence. "Then we find it." Ruth's resolve hardened like cooling iron. "We use his mistakes to bring them down." They made their decision that night. In the morning, they would continue to the county seat, file official complaints, set the wheels of justice turning. They both knew it meant declaring war on Pike openly, with no guarantee of survival. "If something happens to me," Ruth began, but Asher stopped her with a gentle finger to her lips. "We go together or not at all. That's what partnership means." She kissed him then. Not the desperate passion of their first encounter, but something deeper, more certain, a promise made with full understanding of the cost. They prepared for departure like soldiers preparing for battle. Documents secured, weapons cleaned, hearts steeled for whatever came next. The desert had taught them both to be survivors. Now they would learn if they could be warriors for justice as well. Before leaving, Asher hung a small iron bell by the door of their rough shelter. "So the wind will remember to call us home," he explained, almost shy. Ruth touched the bell, setting it ringing across the empty land. Home. Such a small word for such a large hope. But as they rode out together into the uncertain dawn, she carried that soft chiming in her heart like a promise of return. The courthouse waited somewhere beyond the horizon, and with it, either justice or destruction. But they rode side by side, no longer reluctant allies, but something stronger partners who'd chosen each other in the face of the desert's worst cruelties. Behind them, the bell sang in the wind, marking the place where two broken people had started building something whole. The fire came at midnight, orange tongues licking at the darkness like the devil's own harvest. Ruth woke to the acrid smell of burning straw and the terrible sound of animals in panic. Through the window, their newly built hay shed blazed against the star-scattered sky. "The goats!" She grabbed her boots, not bothering to lace them. Asher was already running, his silhouette dark against the flames. Together they fought to free the terrified animals, dodging sparks and falling timber. The young cowhand who'd been helping them, Tom Finch, barely 17, rushed in to help, only to be caught when a beam collapsed. Asher plunged back into the inferno, emerging moments later with the boy slung over his shoulder. But it was too late. The kid who'd been learning to read from Ruth's patient teaching would never finish his first book. Asher knelt in the dust, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. This wasn't the stoic man who calculated water prices. This was raw grief, honest as the flames consuming their winter feed. "Pike's doing," Ruth said quietly, her throat tight with smoke and sorrow. "Another message. Another death on my conscience." Asher's voice was hollow. "How many more, Ruth? How many people die because I won't sell him water rights he thinks he deserves?" "Stop!" She gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Tom died because Pike is a murderer, not because of anything you did or didn't do." They buried the boy at dawn. Just the two of them and Billy, who'd appeared like a ghost when he heard the news. The simple wooden cross looked fragile against the vast sky, another marker in a land already full of graves. The drought arrived like an unwelcome relative, settling in with no sign of leaving. The hand pump wheezed and coughed, producing a trickle where there'd once been a steady stream. Ruth watched their water barrels drop day by day, rationing becoming an art of survival. "I still have my wedding ring," she said one evening, looking at the thin gold band James had placed on her finger. "From before. We could sell it, get materials to line the channel properly." Asher looked up from the ledger where he tracked every precious drop. "No, it's just metal. It doesn't mean—" "Sell my cattle first. Sell my saddle, my guns, anything else. But not that." His eyes held hers. "Memories shouldn't be bartered for survival. We'll find another way." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. This man who'd once charged desperate families for water now protected her past even as they built a future. But the past had teeth, and they showed when Ruth found an old photograph tucked in Asher's saddlebags, him standing with a group of well-dressed men, all wearing the same bull's head pins that James had hidden. "You were one of them." The words tasted like ash. The grass ring, Pike's organization. Asher's face went still as stone. "Was 5 years ago, before I understood what they really were." "And what were they?" "Men who confused ownership with dominion, who thought having meant deserving." He met her gaze steadily. "I left when they decided the Hendricks family needed to be convinced to sell. I thought I was walking away clean. I was wrong." The betrayal stung, but less than the honesty in his confession. Ruth had learned the hard way that people were complicated creatures. capable of both cruelty and redemption. "We've both stood on the wrong side," she said finally. "Maybe that's why we can see the right one so clearly now." Sheriff Harlan chose that moment to appear, his tin star glinting like a threat in the harsh sun. "Mrs. Boone, heard you've been making accusations about Vernon Pike. Slanderous ones." "True ones," Ruth countered. "Without proof, it's just the bitter words of a woman trying to justify her husband's failures." Harlan's smile was thin as paper. "Keep it up, and I'll have to arrest you for disturbing the peace." "Then arrest me." Ruth stepped forward, chin raised. "I'll tell my story to a judge." "Now! Now!" Harlan's hand dropped to his gun. "No need for unpleasantness, but accidents happen to troublemakers. Your first husband learned that." Asher moved so fast Harlan barely had time to flinch. The sheriff found himself pressed against the wall, Asher's forearm across his throat. "Threaten her again," Asher said quietly, "and you'll learn what kind of accidents I can arrange." After Harlan left, spitting threats and promises of retribution, Ruth touched Asher's rigid back. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He turned to her, something fierce and protective in his eyes. "I've lost too much to this land already. I won't lose you too." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ruth felt the last of her walls crumbling, leaving her exposed as the desert itself. That night, Ruth made a decision. While Asher slept, she saddled her horse and rode to town. Mrs. Patterson opened her door despite the late hour, took one look at Ruth's determined face, and led her to a room behind the church. "My husband kept records before he became minister," she said quietly, producing a ring of old keys. "From when he worked at the bank, he always suspected something was wrong with Pike's land acquisitions." In the dusty basement, they found what Ruth needed: ledgers showing payments from Pike to Harlan, notation J.C. handled dated the week James died, evidence of a conspiracy written in columns neat as coffin nails. She was copying the final entries when footsteps creaked overhead. A gunman's voice drifted down. "Know you're here, widow woman. Come out quiet like." Ruth's hand found her pistol, but Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Backstairs," she whispered. "Go." They almost made it. The gunman caught them in the alley, his leer visible in the moonlight. "Pike wants a word with—" The blow came from the shadows. Asher stepped over the unconscious man, shoulder bleeding through a tear in his shirt. "You think I'd let you ride off alone?" "I can take care of myself," Ruth protested even as she pressed her hand to his wound. "I know." His smile was pained but real. "That's what terrifies me." They escaped into the maze of back streets, Mrs. Patterson guiding them to safety with the practiced ease of someone who'd shepherded other desperate souls. The evidence was damning, but they needed to reach the circuit judge alive to use it. Back at their camp, Ruth cleaned and stitched Asher's wound by lamplight. Her hands were steady now, hardened by necessity. He sat still as stone while she worked, but she felt the tension in him, the careful control. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "When I saw the blood, I was afraid of losing you." His hand covered hers where it rested on his chest. "Now you know how I feel every damn day." The honesty of it broke something open in her. She'd been so focused on not being weak, on proving herself capable, that she'd forgotten strength could include vulnerability. "I'm tired of being afraid," she said. "Of Pike, of caring, of living." "Then let's stop." Asher pulled her close with his good arm. "Let's stop being afraid and start being dangerous together." They made plans by candlelight. Leave under cover of darkness. Circle through the salt flats where pursuit would be difficult. Reach the circuit judge at Silver Mesa. It meant abandoning their land temporarily, but staying meant death. Before they left, Asher hung an iron bell by their door. "So the wind will remember," he said simply. Ruth understood. They were leaving. But this was home now, this patch of difficult earth they'd watered with sweat and tears and blood. The bell would sing their promise to return. As they prepared their horses in the pre-dawn darkness, Ruth realized how much had changed since she'd arrived in Dry Creek. She'd come seeking survival and found something richer purpose. Partnership. The terrible and wonderful transformation of grief into love. "Ready?" Asher asked. She checked the documents one last time, secured her rifle, met his eyes in the darkness. "Ready." They rode out together as the first stars began to fade. Two people who'd been broken by this land and rebuilt themselves stronger. Behind them, the bell chimed softly in the wind, a metallic prayer for their return. The desert stretched ahead, vast and unforgiving. But they faced it together now, no longer reluctant partners, but something forged in fire and tested by blood, a marriage built on bones and determination, stronger than the forces trying to tear it apart. The salt flats stretched before them like a lunar sea, white crust crackling under the horses' hooves. Moonlight transformed the landscape into something otherworldly, beautiful and terrible in its desolation. Ruth pulled her kerchief higher, tasting alkali on her lips despite the covering. "Stay close," Asher warned, leading them along a path only he could see. "Stray too far and the crust breaks. Horse goes through. It doesn't come back up." They moved in single file, Billy bringing up the rear on a borrowed pony. The boy had refused to stay behind, claiming he needed to see how the story ended. Ruth understood some tales demanded witnesses. Behind them, wolves howled. But these weren't the four-legged kind. Pike's men had found their trail faster than expected. Gunshots echoed across the flats, muzzle flashes like angry stars in the darkness. "The canyon!" Asher spurred his horse toward a gap in the rising cliffs. "Move!" They thundered into the narrow defile just as bullets sparked off the rocks. The canyon twisted like a snake, moonlight barely penetrating its depths. Ruth focused on Asher's back, trusting him to navigate while she watched their rear. "There." Billy pointed to a widening in the canyon where ancient floods had carved a bowl from the stone. They took positions behind fallen boulders. Ruth checked her ammunition, 12 rounds for the Spencer, 6 for her pistol. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but maybe enough to make Pike's men reconsider. "I count 5, Asher said, sighting down his rifle. "Maybe 6. "Good odds," Ruth replied with dark humor. "We've faced worse." The first attackers appeared at the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the lighter sky. Ruth breathed between heartbeats, squeezed the trigger. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, she was done creating more ghosts than necessary. Return fire chipped stone around them, filling the air with dust and splinters. Billy hugged the ground, eyes wide but determined. Asher fired methodically, making each shot count, driving the attackers to cover. Then a familiar voice rang out. "That's enough!" Marcus Holbrook emerged from the shadows on the opposite ridge, rifle trained on Pike's men below. "Nobody else dies tonight, not for Vernon Pike's greed." "You turncoat bastard!" Harlan's voice, sharp with rage. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But I'm done watching decent folk get murdered for water rights. My brother may have chosen Pike's money, but I choose different." The tableau held Pike's men pinned between two positions, nobody eager to be the first to die for their employer's ambitions. Finally, Harlan gave the order to withdraw, but not before shouting a promise. "This isn't over! Boone!" They waited until the hoofbeats faded before emerging. Marcus climbed down to join them, moving with the easy grace of a man raised in rough country. "Why?" Asher asked simply. "Saw you at that birthing couple? Heard about young Tom's funeral? A man shows his true nature in how he treats the helpless and honors the dead." Marcus shrugged. "Besides, my mother would haunt me if I stood by while a woman got murdered. She had opinions about such things." They reached Silver Mesa as dawn painted the mountains crimson. The town was larger than Dry Creek, boasting an actual courthouse and a hotel that didn't rent rooms by the hour. Judge O'Rourke held court in a building that managed to look imposing despite the chickens pecking around its foundation. O'Rourke himself was a surprise younger than expected, with clever eyes and ink-stained fingers that spoke of a man who did his own writing. He listened to their story without interruption, examining each piece of evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. "This ledger," he said finally, tapping the damning entries. "Mrs. Patterson risked much to share this." "She believes in justice," Ruth replied. "As do I." O'Rourke's smile was sharp as a blade. "But Pike will try to buy his way out. He has resources." "I have this." Ruth placed her wedding ring on the desk, not James's ring, but the simple band Asher had fashioned from wire when they'd had nothing else. "I'm not buying justice, Your Honor. I'm showing you I have nothing left to lose but the truth." The judge studied the humble ring, then pushed it back across the desk. "Keep it. Some things shouldn't be bartered." He began writing orders. "Sheriff Harlan is hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. Vernon Pike is to be arrested on charges of murder, conspiracy, and water rights fraud." The relief nearly buckled Ruth's knees. Asher's hand found hers, steady and sure. But Pike wasn't finished. He arrived that evening with a lawyer and a carpet bag bulging with bills, the courtroom filled with townspeople drawn by the drama, including Mrs. Patterson, who'd made the journey despite the danger. "Your Honor." Pike's lawyer began smoothly. "These accusations are the desperate fantasies of a widow seeking someone to blame for her husband's unfortunate accident." "James Carver was murdered," Ruth interrupted, standing. "Shot on a trail he was directed to by Pike's people. I have the map he carried, showing water sources that threaten Pike's monopoly. Hearsay and speculation. I have his journal." Ruth produced James's small leather book. His last entry mentions meeting with Pike about water rights. He was dead within the week. The courtroom stirred. Pike's controlled mask slipped, revealing something ugly beneath. "And I have this." Marcus stepped forward, placing a bull's head pin on the judge's bench. "My membership in the grass ring. I sat in meetings where Pike discussed removing obstacles. James Carver was named as one such obstacle." The testimony continued into the night. Mrs. Patterson presented the bank records. Asher detailed the systematic theft of water rights. Billy, in a clear young voice that carried surprising authority, told of seeing Harlan meet with Pike's men the night before raids. O'Rourke's gavel fell like thunder. "Vernon Pike, you are bound over for trial on multiple charges. Sheriff Harlan, you are under arrest for conspiracy and abuse of office." Pike rose, face mottled with rage. "You think this ends it? I own half this territory. You'll never make it stick." "Perhaps not," O'Rourke agreed calmly. "But justice has a way of flowing like water. It finds its level eventually." They emerged from the courthouse to find the town transformed. People who'd lived in fear of Pike's reach suddenly discovered courage. Stories poured forth water stolen. Claims jumped, families driven out. The empire Pike had built on threats and murder began to crumble as its foundation was exposed. That night, in their hotel room, the first real bed they'd shared, Ruth and Asher held each other in the darkness. Victory should have felt sweeter, but they both knew this was just the beginning. "He'll come for us," Ruth said quietly. "Men like Pike don't accept defeat." "Let him come." Asher's arms tightened around her. "We've faced worse odds." She turned in his embrace, finding his face in the darkness. "I need to tell you something. In case we don't get another chance." "Ruth." "I love you." The words came easier than expected. "Not because you saved me or because we were forced together. I love the man who teaches boys to read and delivers babies in the desert, who carries water for those who thirst and builds bells to remember home." His kiss was answer enough, deep and certain as water in the desert. When they finally pulled apart, he whispered against her hair, "You saved me too." from becoming stone, from forgetting why water matters more than wealth, from dying inside while my body walked around. They made love like survivors, with the desperate tenderness of those who know tomorrow isn't promised. Every touch was a vow, every whispered word a prayer against the darkness waiting outside. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the knowledge that their fight was far from over. But as they prepared to return to Dry Creek, to face whatever Pike's revenge might bring, Ruth felt a calm she hadn't known since James died. She'd found justice for her first husband and love with her second. She'd discovered strength she never knew she possessed, and the courage to use it. The desert had tried to break her and failed. Now it was time to go home, to that patch of difficult earth where a bell waited to ring their return. Time to prove that some things, love, justice, hope could grow even in the harshest ground. "Ready?" Asher asked, checking his rifle. Ruth smiled, fierce and free. "I've been ready since the day I set foot in Dry Creek." They rode out together as the sun climbed, no longer fleeing but returning as warriors. Behind them, Silver Mesa buzzed with change. Ahead, their future waited uncertain. Dangerous, but theirs to claim. The desert watched with ancient eyes as they passed, recognizing its own survivors who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the winning, but in the refusing to be defeated. Winter arrived like a bad debt come due, howling down from the mountains with teeth of ice. The first storm caught them still repairing the damage from Pike's raids, and Ruth learned what true cold meant in high desert country. Wind that cut through wool like paper, frost that painted the inside walls white, the constant battle to keep the stove fed and water from freezing solid. She found Asher one morning chipping ice from the pump handle, his breath clouding in the bitter air. His hands were cracked despite the gloves, bleeding at the knuckles where the cold had split skin. "Let me," she said, taking the hammer from him. "I can manage." "I know you can." She pushed him gently toward the house. "That's not the point anymore, is it? We do things together now." Inside, she heated water and tended his hands, wrapping them carefully. The intimacy of the simple act, her thumb smoothing salve into his palms, carried more weight than any words. They'd learned each other's rhythms, how he took his coffee black, 2 sugars when they had it, how she hummed while cooking off key but earnest, the way they moved around each other in the small space like dancers who'd found their tempo. Billy had become a permanent fixture, officially hired as a hand, but really something closer to the son neither had expected. Ruth taught him letters by lamplight, patient with his struggles, celebrating each small victory. Asher showed him how to read weather in cloud formations, how to gentle a spooked horse, skills that would keep him alive in this unforgiving country. "You're getting soft," Ruth teased one evening, watching Asher help Billy with his arithmetic. "Maybe," he agreed, not looking up from the slate. "Turns out soft isn't the weakness I thought it was." But the desert had ways of testing any softness. Thomas and Mary Brewster, the couple whose child they'd delivered, knocked on their door in the middle of a blizzard. Thomas supported his wife, who burned with fever, the baby wailing weakly in her arms. "Nowhere else to go," Thomas gasped. "Town doctor won't come out in this weather, and we remembered your kindness." They brought them in without hesitation. For 3 days, Ruth and Asher fought death in that small space. Ruth bathed Mary's fever, spooned broth between cracked lips, walked the floor with little faith when her mother was too weak. Asher rode through the storm twice for supplies, returning coated in ice but carrying precious medicine from town. The 4th dawn brought broken fever and hope. Mary's eyes cleared, focusing on her daughter nursing contentedly. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved yourselves by surviving the journey here," Ruth corrected. "We just helped a little." Word spread as word always did in the territory. The Boones had opened their home, shared their resources, asked nothing in return. When spring finally broke winter's grip, they found unexpected gifts at their door: a knitted blanket, preserves, a carved wooden spoon. Small things. But in this country, such gestures were declarations of community. Even more surprising was the change in town. Vernon Pike awaited trial in the territorial prison, his empire crumbling as more victims found courage to speak, without his shadow looming. Dry Creek began to reshape itself. The new sheriff, a former cavalry sergeant named Walsh, actually investigated crimes. Water rights were re-examined, stolen claims restored. But the past wasn't done with them yet. Ruth woke one night from dreams of James, tears on her face before she was fully conscious. Asher held her without asking questions, understanding that grief wasn't linear, that loving him didn't erase the pain of her first loss. "I dream about Sam sometimes," he offered into the darkness. "See him young and laughing, before the drought. Wake up thinking I can save him this time." "Does it ever stop hurting?" "No, but it changes. Becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you." They lay together in the darkness, sharing the weight of their ghosts. It was its own intimacy. Deeper than passion, the trust to be broken in front of another person and know they wouldn't look away. The real test came when Ruth decided to make prickly pear jam. She'd avoided it since that day in town when the churchwomen had scorned her. But spring brought a bounty of fruit, and waste was sin in the desert. "You sure?" Asher asked, watching her prepare the jars. "I'm tired of letting other people's opinions shape my choices." She smiled, fierce and determined. "Besides, it's good jam." At the spring market, she set up her table with quiet dignity. The first hour brought stares and whispers, but no customers. Then Mrs. Patterson approached, coin purse in hand. "2 jars, please. My husband has been hoping you'd make more." The purchase broke the dam. Whether from genuine interest or curiosity about the woman who'd brought down Vernon Pike, people began buying. By noon, Ruth had sold every jar. "Proud of you," Asher said quietly, helping her pack the empty crates. "For selling jam. For refusing to be small when the world wanted to shrink you." That evening, they received an unexpected visitor. Judge O'Rourke arrived dusty from travel, bringing news that changed everything. "Pike was murdered in prison last night. Throat cut. They're saying it was another inmate, but—" He shrugged. "Men like Pike make enemies everywhere. The important thing is, he won't be testifying against his conspirators." Ruth felt no satisfaction, only a weary recognition of frontier justice. "So the others go free." "Some will, but the main thing is, his claims are void. The water rights revert to the territorial government for redistribution." O'Rourke smiled. "I've recommended that Tract 14 receive full access to the aquifer. Seems only fair, given what you've endured. Water rights, the gold of the desert, now theirs by law instead of sufferance." Ruth gripped Asher's hand, feeling the weight of victory that had cost so much. They celebrated quietly that night, sharing a bottle of wine Asher had been saving. Billy played his harmonica badly, but with enthusiasm, while they danced in the yard under stars that seemed less hostile than before. "What now?" Ruth asked, her head on Asher's shoulder as they swayed. "Now we build properly this time. A real house, a bigger well, maybe even trees if we can coax them to grow." He pulled back to look at her. "Make it a place worth staying." "It already is," she said simply. The transformation wasn't just in the land. Ruth caught her reflection while washing and barely recognized herself. Gone was the pale widow who'd stepped off the stage nearly a year ago. In her place stood a woman carved by sun and wind, hands scarred but capable, eyes that had seen the worst and chosen to hope anyway. Asher had changed too. The rigid water baron had become someone who shared freely, who taught and protected and trusted. Together they'd found a balance hard enough to survive, soft enough to truly live. "I've been thinking," Ruth said one morning, watching the sunrise paint the mountains, "about children." Asher's hand stilled on the harness he was mending. "Oh, not bearing them. That dream died with James, but Billy needs siblings. There are other orphans in the territory, other children who need what we can give. A family built on choice rather than chance. He considered, sounds about right for us. She kissed him then, tasting coffee and possibility. They'd started with a reluctant marriage, built on scandal and survival. Now they were choosing each other daily, constructing something that could shelter more than just themselves. The bell by their door rang in the morning breeze, calling them to another day's work. But now it sounded less like longing and more like celebration, a song of home found in the most unlikely place, with the most unexpected person. Ruth Boone, who'd been Ruth Carver, who'd been nobody special at all, stood in her doorway and surveyed her kingdom. 40 acres of difficult earth, a wealth of water, a husband who'd become her true partner, a boy who needed parents, a community learning to trust again. The desert had tested her with everything it had: death, drought, violence, isolation. She'd survived it all and discovered that survival was just the beginning. Now came the harder task: learning to thrive. But as Asher joined her in the doorway, solid and sure beside her, she knew they were ready for whatever came next. They'd been forged in fire and tempered by loss, and what emerged was stronger than either could have been alone. "Good morning, Mrs. Boone," he said, as he did every morning now. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she replied, and went to start the coffee. Life in the desert continued, harsh and beautiful in theirs. The letter from Ohio arrived on a Tuesday, water-stained and bearing news that would close the final chapter of Ruth's past. The county prosecutor needed her testimony in the trial of James's killers, not Pike, now beyond earthly justice, but others in the conspiracy who'd operated from eastern offices, selling death along with worthless land deeds. Ruth read it twice, then handed it to Asher. "They want me to come back. Tell James's story in court." He studied the official script, understanding the weight of it. "You have to go." "I don't want to leave." The admission surprised her with its fierceness. "Not now. Not when we're finally. I'll be here when you get back." His certainty was bedrock solid. "This place isn't going anywhere, and neither am I." The preparation for departure became a dance of unspoken fears. Ruth mended clothes she hadn't worn in a year, packed documents in oilcloth, tried not to think about all the ways the desert could claim someone traveling alone. Asher crafted a small bell from scrap iron, working late into the night. "To remember," he said simply, pressing it into her hands. "So you don't forget the sound of home." Billy watched the preparations with worried eyes. On her last night, he finally voiced his fear. "You're coming back, aren't you? You ain't leaving like everyone else does." Ruth pulled him close. This boy who'd become family without blood or law to make it so. "I'm coming back. This is my home. You're my family. Nothing in Ohio can change that." The parting at the stage depot was brief by necessity, lingering by need. Asher's hands framed her face, memorizing. "All right," he promised. "Keep the well flowing, keep Billy studying, keep the place ready for you." "Keep yourself safe," she countered. "I've gotten used to you being around." Their kiss was witnessed by half the town, but Ruth no longer cared about scandal. Let them see what real partnership looked like: two people choosing each other despite distance and difficulty. The journey east was a reverse migration, desert giving way to prairie, prairie to farmland, the green growing oppressive after so much honest brown. Ruth watched the landscape change through the stage window and felt like a stranger to the woman who'd made this journey westward in grief and desperation. Ohio hadn't changed, but her eyes had. The neat farms looked small, the orderly towns confining. Her sister Sarah met her at the station, exclaiming over her sun-darkened skin and work-roughened hands. "You look like a field hand," Sarah fussed. "We'll get you cleaned up, find you some proper clothes." "These are proper clothes," Ruth interrupted gently. "They're mine." The courthouse in Columbus was imposing brick and proper procedure. Nothing like Judge O'Rourke's chicken-pecked frontier justice. Ruth sat straight-backed in the witness chair, speaking truth to men in city suits who'd never known thirst or felt their skin crack from alkali wind. Mrs. Carver, excuse me. Mrs. Boone, can you identify this document? She studied James's journal, his careful handwriting bringing an echo of old pain. Yes, my first husband's record of his dealings with the Eastern Pacific Land Company. And this map shows the route he was directed to take through Vernon Pike's holdings, the route where he was murdered. The defense attorney tried to shake her, painting her as a bitter widow seeking revenge, a woman of questionable morals who'd married hastily for protection. Ruth met each attack with calm truth, Asher's small bell tucked in her pocket like a talisman. You claim to have evidence of conspiracy, yet your first husband was apparently part of this alleged criminal organization. He was, Ruth's voice carried across the courtroom. James made mistakes. He got involved with dishonest men, believed promises that were lies. But when he tried to make it right, to expose the fraud, they killed him for it. His death doesn't erase his wrongs, but neither do his wrongs erase the crime of his murder. The trial lasted a week, each night. Ruth returned to Sarah's tidy house and felt the walls closing in. Her sister meant well, but her constant attempts to civilize Ruth back into an Ohio widow were exhausting. You could stay, Sarah suggested over tea. Sell that desert claim. Use the money to set up here. Find a proper husband. I have a proper husband. Ruth's smile was sharp as desert wind. And a home, and a life I built with my own hands. I'm not running from it, I'm running to it. The verdict came on a Thursday, guilty on all counts. The land company executives would serve time, their assets seized for restitution to victims. Ruth felt the last chain to her old life snap clean. But there was one more duty. She hired a buggy and drove to the cemetery where James lay. The stone was already weathering, his name softening under Ohio rain. Ruth knelt in the damp grass, not to mourn but to say goodbye properly. I know the truth now, she said quietly. All of it, the good and the bad, the dreams and the failures. I forgive you for the lies, James, and I forgive myself for surviving. She left her old wedding ring on his grave, the one she'd carried all this way without quite knowing why. It belonged to the past now, to the woman she'd been when loving meant losing herself. The woman she was now loved differently, stronger, with eyes wide open. The return journey felt like release. Each mile west lifted weight from her shoulders. Each glimpse of widening sky made her breathe easier. When the stage finally rolled into Dry Creek, she was already standing before it fully stopped. Asher was there, of course, thinner than she'd left him, clothes dusty from hard riding, but his smile when he saw her was worth every mile. Ruth didn't wait for propriety or assistance. She jumped from the stage into his arms, not caring who watched or what they thought. You came back, he murmured into her hair. I told you I would. She pulled back to look at him. This man who'd waited with faith she was still learning to deserve. This is home. Your home. Billy burst from the crowd, nearly knocking them both over with his enthusiasm. He'd grown in just weeks, starting that stretch toward manhood, but his grin was pure boy. I read a whole book while you were gone, and Asher taught me to cipher accounts. And we fixed the fence, and... Breathe, boy. Asher laughed, but his hand on Billy's shoulder was proud. The ride to Tract 14 was a celebration of familiar sights, the red rocks, the sparse vegetation, the endless sky that had once seemed threatening and now felt like freedom. When their land came into view, Ruth saw the changes, reinforced buildings, a new corral, green shoots where Asher had coaxed a kitchen garden into existence. You've been busy, she observed. Had to be. Promised my wife I'd keep the place ready for her. He helped her down from the wagon, hands lingering on her waist. Welcome home, Ruth. That night, they sat outside watching stars emerge like scattered salt. Ruth told him about the trial, about her sister's incomprehension, about leaving James's ring on his grave. Asher listened without judgment, understanding the need to close doors properly before opening new ones. "I'm different now," Ruth said finally. "Not the woman who kissed you under these stars, not the widow who came seeking survival. I don't know who I am exactly, but I know who I'm becoming." "Good," Asher said simply. "I'd hate to be the only one changing around here." They made love under those same stars, on blankets spread over ground that had witnessed their first kiss, their reluctant wedding, their gradual transformation from strangers to partners to something deeper than either had words for. Ruth traced the scars on Asher's body, each one a story of survival, and showed him her own, visible and invisible. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier now with practice. "Not because I need you, not because we were forced together, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." "And I choose you," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "Today, tomorrow, all the days after." In the morning, Ruth woke to familiar sounds, coffee percolating, Billy practicing his letters aloud, horses nickering for grain, but everything felt new, charged with the electricity of completion. She'd left to bury the past and returned to embrace the future. At breakfast, Billy presented her with a carved wooden spoon, crooked but crafted with obvious care. "I made it while you were gone, so you'd have something that was just yours." Ruth turned the humble gift in her hands, throat tight. In Ohio, her sister had offered china and crystal, the trappings of a proper life. Here, a boy who'd known hunger gave her a tool for feeding others. She knew which gift held more value. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The day unfolded with the rhythm of necessary work, water to haul, animals to tend, the endless battle against desert entropy. But Ruth threw herself into it with joy, grateful for the burn of sun, the ache of muscles, the simple pleasure of building something with her own hands beside people she'd chosen. As evening approached, she and Asher stood together surveying their domain, 40 acres that had seemed like a curse when she'd arrived, now transformed into possibility by water and will and love. "No regrets?" Asher asked quietly. Ruth thought of Ohio's green fields, of comfort and convention and safety. Then she looked at this man who'd taught her that softness could be strength, at the boy who'd become family, at the land that had carved her into someone she actually liked being. "Not one," she said, and meant it down to her bones. The bell by their door rang in the evening breeze, a sound that no longer spoke of longing but of arrival. Ruth Boone was home. Not in a place, but in a life built from scratch on unforgiving ground, with people who'd earned her trust through trial and time. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, desert life guaranteed that. But tonight, surrounded by chosen family under familiar stars, Ruth knew she'd found what she hadn't even known she was seeking, not just survival, but a life worth living. The desert had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to see what they could grow in this hard-won ground. Spring arrived like a miracle that year, painting the desert in colors Ruth hadn't known it possessed. Purple lupine carpeted the valleys, cacti crowned themselves with impossible blooms, and water ran clear and steady through the channels they'd carved with blood and determination. The land that had tried to kill her now offered up beauty like an apology. Ruth stood in her garden, a real garden now, with rows of squash and beans fighting their way through the sandy soil, and marveled at what persistence could accomplish. Asher worked nearby with Tom Brewster, raising the frame for what would become a proper workshop. The men had developed an easy partnership, sharing tools and knowledge, building community one board at a time. "Ruth," Billy's voice carried across the yard, excited as a young colt's. "Look what I wrote." She wiped her hands on her apron and examined his slate. The letters were still crooked, but they spelled out words that made her heart swell. Water, home, hope. "Perfect," she said, ruffling his sun-bleached hair. "Those are the most important words in any language." The bell by their door rang out, announcing visitors. These days, it was a welcome sound. Mrs. Patterson arrived with several other women, including some who'd once whispered behind their hands about the scandal of Ruth's marriage. "We're forming a school board," Mrs. Patterson announced. "The territory's providing funds, and we need a teacher, someone patient, who understands children who've known hardship." Ruth's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "You're asking me? Who else you've taught Billy to read when everyone said he was too wild to learn? You've got Marcus Holbrook working on his numbers. Even old Mr. Gunther says you explained irrigation in a way that finally made sense." Ruth looked at Asher, who nodded encouragement. "The pay's not much," Mrs. Patterson continued, "but it's steady. And Lord knows these children need someone who sees their potential instead of their problems." "Yes," Ruth said simply. "Yes, I'll do it." The women stayed for coffee and planning, their chatter filling the small house with warmth. It was civilization coming to the desert, not imposed from outside, but growing from within, nurtured by people who'd learned to value each other through shared struggle. That evening, Asher surprised her with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a simple brass bell, smaller than the one by their door, but polished to a warm glow. "For your classroom," he explained, "to call the children to learning." Ruth turned the bell in her hands, hearing in imagination the voices it would summon ranch children and town children, those with shoes and those without, all equal in their need for knowledge and their right to receive it. "It's perfect," she said, echoing her words to Billy about his carved spoon. Out here, the simplest gifts carried the most weight. The anniversary of their wedding, that desperate, pragmatic ceremony born of scandal, approached without fanfare. They'd never celebrated it before. The date too tangled with difficult memories. But this year felt different. "I've been thinking," Asher said over breakfast, his tone casual in that way that meant he'd been planning something. "Maybe we should do it proper this time. Say the words because we mean them, not because we have to." Ruth's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Boone, after we're already married?" "I'm proposing we marry each other for real. No sheriff's threats, no newspaper scandal, no desperation, just us, choosing each other in front of the people who matter." The simplicity of it, the rightness, made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. "Yes," she said, "again and always. Yes." They held the ceremony where it had all begun, on the rise overlooking the valley where they'd shared that first star-crossed kiss. But this time, they were surrounded by friends who'd become family. Mrs. Patterson's husband presided, his words about partnership and perseverance carrying the weight of witnessed truth. Ruth wore a simple dress she'd made herself, decorated with silver buttons Asher had traded for. He wore his best shirt and a smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. Billy stood as witness, proud and fidgeting, while Marcus played a haunting melody on his fiddle. "Do you, Ruth, take this man not because you must, but because you choose to—" "I do." The words rang across the desert, certain as water over stone. "Do you, Asher, take this woman not for convenience or protection, but for love?" "I do." His voice carried the weight of promises kept and new ones being made. When they kissed, the small gathering cheered. Someone had brought Chinese firecrackers from the railroad camp, and they exploded in the clear air like celebrating stars. The newspaper would report it simply, "Local couple renews vows." No scandal this time, just truth. The celebration continued into the evening. Tables appeared from wagons, laden with food that represented the territory's diversity. Mexican tamales, German strudel, Chinese dumplings, American cornbread. Children ran between the adults' legs while fiddle music competed with guitar and harmonica. Ruth found a quiet moment to stand with Asher, looking out over the land they'd claimed through stubbornness and sacrifice. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of copper and rose. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "About children. I know I said before that dream died with James, but you've been thinking different." It wasn't a question. Asher knew her moods, her hesitations. "Not bearing them. That time has passed, and I've made my peace with it. But Billy needs brothers, sisters. There are so many children out here who need what we can give. A family built by choice." Asher mused, repeating her words from months ago. "Seems fitting for us. You'd want that, taking on other people's broken pieces, trying to make them whole." He turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. "Ruth, that's what we've been doing all along. With each other, with Billy, with this whole damn community. Why stop now?" She kissed him then, tasting promises and possibilities. Around them, their neighbors danced and laughed, creating the sound of community in a place that had known too much isolation. As the evening wound down, Ruth found herself beside the bell they'd hung that desperate night before fleeing to Silver Mesa. She rang it once, clear and true, and the sound carried across the valley like a blessing. "What are you thinking?" Asher asked, joining her. "About that newspaper headline. The widow kissed the rich cowboy beneath the stars only to rise as his reluctant wife." She smiled at the memory that no longer stung. "They got it all wrong, didn't they?" "How so?" "I wasn't rising. I was falling into something real and difficult and absolutely right. And we were never reluctant. Not really. Just scared of hoping for too much. And now?" Ruth looked at their land. No longer 40 acres of desolation, but home, pure and simple. She thought of the school she'd teach in, the children they'd raise, the water flowing through channels they'd carved together. The desert had tested them with everything it had: drought, death, human greed, and they'd not only survived, but learned to bloom. "Now I'm not scared of anything," she said. "Not with you beside me." The stars came out, brilliant in the clear desert air, witnesses to all that had changed since that first kiss. But Ruth no longer looked to them for answers. Everything she needed was right here in the calloused hand that held hers, in the laughter of friends becoming family, in the bell that sang of home across the darkness. They'd started as strangers bound by desperation and scandal. They'd become partners through necessity, lovers through proximity, family through choice. Now they were simply Ruth and Asher Boone, not perfect, but perfect for each other, building something lasting in a land that specialized in taking everything away. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Ruth breathed it in, this air that had once choked her, now sweet as water in her lungs. She was home, not just in a place, but in a life built from scratch with hands that had learned gentleness through hardship. "Ready to go in?" Asher asked. Ruth squeezed his hand and nodded. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, students to teach, water to manage, a family to grow. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of community, and held by the man who'd taught her that love could be both refuge and adventure, she knew they'd face whatever came. Together, they walked back to their house, no longer a shelter but a home. Behind them, the bells sang one last time in the wind, a sound that would echo through the years as more buildings rose, more families arrived, more life took root in the unforgiving ground. The widow and the water baron had become simply Ruth and Asher, proof that even in the hardest places, love could flow like water through stone, carving channels of hope that would nurture generations to come. In the great saga of the American West, theirs was just one story among thousands, but it was theirs, written in scars and tears and stubborn joy, a testament to the transformative power of choosing to stay, to build, to love when leaving would have been easier. The desert had made them, and they had made a life. That was miracle enough for anyone. Thank you for listening to this tale of love and survival in the Old West. Where are you enjoying this story from? Please share your location in the comments so we can connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts about Ruth and Asher's journey. Did their story touch your heart? What part resonated most with you? Your comments help us bring more authentic Western tales to life.